So greetings, everybody, and welcome to City Lights Live. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we have joining us Premal Dharia, Maria Hawilo, discussing their new book titled Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change. It is published by our friends over at FSG Originals, and it's edited with their colleague, James Forman Jr. The book takes the form of a reader, bringing together the voices of activists, experts, and formerly incarcerated people to generate an invaluable guide for anyone who wishes to understand mass incarceration and hasten its end. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Numerous dialects of their language are spoken along the peninsula. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who came before us as stewards of the land. Over the last few decades, the national conversation surrounding mass incarceration has heated up considerably, and yet the vast apparatus of the carceral state remains intact. The question of how its damage and depredations can be undone remains as vital as ever, and Premal Dharia, James Forman Jr., and Maria Hawilo are three of the nation's leading advocates for the dismantling of mass incarceration. And with their new book, provide us with the tools to move beyond despair and the treadmill of critique towards hope and action. The book surveys various approaches to confronting a carceral state, exploring practical interventions involving police, prosecutors, public defenders, judges, prisons, and even life after prison, rather than prescribing solutions. The book offers a forum for discussions about how to best confront the harms of mass incarceration. The contributors range from such noted figures as Angela Davis, Clint Smith, Larry Krasner, and many, many others. It's an impressive roster and makes this a powerful and eye-opening work. The editors have done a great service to the community, and it is an honor to have them with us here tonight. Premal Dharia is the executive director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at Harvard Law School and is co-editor-in-chief of Inquest. She has written for the Washington Post, CNN, Slate, and other publications. Maria Hawilo is distinguished professor in residency at Loyola University, where she studies mass incarceration. She has served as a supervising attorney for the District of Columbia's Public Defender Service, representing individuals charged with felony offenses. She was a member of the Forensic Practical Group, a committee focused on the use of forensic science in the courtroom. She's also served as law clerk for the Honorable David W. McKean, U.S. District Court, Western District of Michigan. To moderate the discussion tonight, we're also going to be joined by Josie Duffy Rice, who is a journalist, writer, law school graduate, and podcast host whose work is primarily focused on prosecutors, prisons, and other criminal justice issues. She's the host of the podcast Unreformed and Justice in America, and the co-host of the podcast What a Day. Really such an honor to have her with us as well. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Premal Dharia, Maria Hawilo, and Josie Duffy Rice. Such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to City Lights for sponsoring this event, and especially thank you to Josie for being in conversation with us. If you haven't listened to her podcast, she's incredible, and we're so glad to be here with all of you.
Well, thank you so much. I think you guys are incredible, and I am very excited to be invited. So thank you to you all. If you guys have questions as you're joining, please write them in the chat. We will go through questions maybe at the end, maybe in the middle. We'll see how we're feeling. It's a conversation. It's going to be great. So I wanted to, well, first I wanted to start by telling you all that according to all my group chats, this is the best book cover of the year, which is very impressive because, you know, we have a lot of opinions on book covers. So that is the first thing I'd like to say. Great cover, great design. But I wanted to, this is a really incredible book. It's an incredible, like, I feel like it does something that's pretty amazing, which is that it is useful for people who are just learning about this and useful for people who've done it for years. It's like an incredibly thorough and navigable resource that like has just so much good information in it and so many interesting ideas and thoughts, and really kind of tracks how people come to the work. So that is my push for getting it and then getting like a friend copy because they're going to love it. But I wanted to start by asking you all what made you want to write this book. Like, this is not, you guys come from this work, actually kind of all three come from this work from a sort of similar place, but have come to like the publishing space of this differently. And so I wanted to just get a sense from you all how this idea kind of came to fruition.
Maria.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Josie. The three of us are former public defenders, and really so much of our identity is wrapped up in that work that we did for so many years, representing people who were charged with criminal offenses, sitting with them when the state's massive power sort of threatened to overtake everything that they knew, to remove them from their communities. And that is work that sort of stays with you. And that is experience that stays with you. As we moved through our careers after being public defenders, and as you said, Josie, we sort of went to different places. I started teaching, I was at Northwestern for many years, and then I started teaching a course at Loyola on mass incarceration. And as I was putting together readings, I realized, there's so many incredible books that help explain how we got where we got. Books that are invaluable, frankly, to understand the problem, or to help us understand the consequences of this system or non-system. But as I talked with students, and then later to different groups, the question that came up the most was, okay, we get the causes and we understand the consequences, but what can we do? Is there a role for us? How can we do something about this? And it's a question you hear not just in this space, but in other spaces. And so, I won't speak for Premal, but we sort of came together and started talking and debating. And that question stayed at the forefront of this work. And it really became, well, what can an ordinary person do? What can the educator do? What can the public defender do, or the judge do? And that's, for me at least, how this began.
And I'll just jump in to say I agree. And one thing I'll just add is that, the way the book is structured, and, we can talk more about that, but we wanted to demonstrate and illustrate, I guess, what a sort of big, messy, bureaucratic machinery it is. And in doing so, our hope and sort of intention was to display all of the many intervention points that exist for folks, right? So folks are either organizing or they're not in their communities if they want to be. And maybe they have ideas about the kinds of interventions they want to make, or maybe they don't. But in displaying all of these sort of parts of the system and the actors in the system, there's a hope that new ideas can be sparked about intervention points, because there are a million of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That was my next question about how it's organized, because you could see this book being organized lots of different ways, like by issue, or by kind of solution category, or by year, or there are just all these different ways to think of this work, right? And or by stage. I think at some point you guys say you're organizing by stage, but it's actually, to me, much more specific than that. It's by person. And so often when you talk about the criminal justice system, it's this thing was done to this person, but there's no by who, who did the thing, right? And so it's very tangible, I think, to have the book organized this way. And I was just wondering if the thought process of what went into that, why did you guys choose to do it this way and not by topic, or chronologically, or however you could have, all the other ways you could have thought of it?
Do you want me to go, Maria, or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, go
I'll say a couple of things in response to that. One is that we were all public defenders. And so so part of the sort of cadence of someone's experience in the system is something that like we're very familiar with and like makes sense in some ways in terms of how to understand and explain what the experience of the criminal legal system is for many people. And so that's like sort of one reason that we structured it that way. But it's kind of zooming out a little bit and thinking about, there are a million ways that one could talk about mass incarceration, ending mass incarceration, challenging it. And there are a million approaches, right? There's sort of like organizing approaches, there's issue-based approaches, there's lots of different sort of thematic approaches. We, one of the things that I think is really important to be able to share with folks, and that we hope this book does, is not just sort of here's what the system looks like so you can understand it better, but here's what the system looks like with all of these sort of openings exposed. So, within sort of the different parts of the machinery of it, there are these actors, and there are these buildings, and there are these processes, and naming them, not just for the sake of naming them, because I think many people know, and if they don't, it's not particularly helpful to just sort of explain what's happening, but to sort of make visible the crevices and the sort of like tension points of where power lies or doesn't, or where it could be leveraged, or where something could be challenged, or where folks are already organizing and challenging. We hoped would spark interest in getting involved and doing something, and also creative ideas about new things that could be done that we haven't even thought of or that others haven't thought of. So that was part of the idea.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Maria,
And oh yeah, sorry. And I'll just say a couple other things. We sort of are tracking the life of a case or client's experiences, people's experiences through the system. But we also wanted to show how much of a non-system this really was. In other words, there's no one person or one actor or one solution you can point to. And I think oftentimes when we talk about either mass incarceration or the criminal justice system, we're all picturing one person to hold accountable. And so, over and over throughout our careers, you'd go talk to the police officers and they'd say, well, we're not charging the case. Talk to the prosecutor. We're just arresting people. We're not responsible in the end for the convictions. And then you talk to the prosecutor and they say, talk to the judge. They're sentencing people. And then he went on and on. And so what we wanted and what we'd hoped we would do with this is show that, look, well, there's not one particular place we can look for interventions. There are all these opportunities to step in, whether you're working inside the system or you're just trying to learn about it. Look at this massive disorganized place where there are all these intervention points, places where we can do something. I mean, all of us in one way or another.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's also like an interesting frame because it feels like it can feel very overwhelming to think of all the problems and all the ways and all the places there are problems. You can feel, I think, especially if you do this work, you get that sense of like, it's too big. Like, I can't fix it. Nobody can fix it, right? If you fix this part, there's still this part, that part, and the other. And there is a sense in this book of like, all the places that are problems are also places for intervention. Like it's shifting it kind of to like an opportunity frame, which I feel like is really, really helpful. And I, in this like kind of massive compilation, there's a lot of kind of wrestling with ideas. Like, it's not just people being like, here's the answer. It's like, I'm figuring this out. I've started here and I'm ending here. And maybe next time I read about it, I'll end up somewhere else. Like, I think about, you have Paul Butler in here talking about like, who, like, can someone be good in a prosecutor? And like all these big questions about abolition, et cetera. So like, I guess I'm interested in how you guys decided what was going to go in, like what was the process, and like what you could have picked a lot of people saying this is the answer, but you didn't, right? And so why was that? And you know, what are you hoping that like that leaves people who are reading it with?
I'll tackle the first part, and then Premal, maybe you can do the second part of that. I think that's exactly sort of right, Josie. How did we pick? There are hundreds of thousands of articles. I don't know how many books written about mass incarceration, and you know, we debated, we discussed, we disagreed, and all three of these show up in this book. The tensions are there because there isn't, you know, I think there is now a general consensus that mass incarceration is it's outrageous and unjust, and for some of us it's immoral, but there isn't sort of consensus about what to do. And that dialogue, that debate, and that tension isn't something we shy away from. It's there because we really want the readers to grapple with it in the same way that we did in talking about amongst ourselves. We wanted it to be readable. And so the pieces really, we were focused on making sure that, you know, someone who has no exposure to this could pick it up. Whether it's, you know, someone first starting to think about this, or a student, or someone who's been thinking about it for a long time. And we wanted to sort of highlight and uplift the changes folks were trying to make in different places. And so all of that became important in part because, you know, when folks are like, when students are like, well, what can I do? I mean, oftentimes there really is, or anybody, what can I do? It seems so massive, feels like nothing can be done. And yet there are all these sort of concrete things one can do. And so those are some of our reasons for including the pieces that we have here. So, and I'll turn it over to Premal here to talk about that second part, sort of what gives you the hope.
Yeah, but I want to echo one thing that Maria said, which is that we struggled and debated a lot, and don't like did not agree about everything, and continue to not agree about everything, right? So like that's just part of it, and that's okay. We just sort of, you know, I think that's just
3 editors.
real.
That's
right. That's real for real people. And so, you know, there like every single piece in the book is something that we all agreed could be in the book and should be in the book. And like, does my personal analysis like adhere to every single piece? Like, no, right? So that's true for Maria and James as well. And I sort of love that about the book, that it's it leaves a lot of space. We wanted, I'll say 2 things. One is that we wanted people to be able to author their own ideas and sort of goals, and not be prescriptive about what they should be. And part of that, I think that's really important. And part of what I hope the book offers to folks is some material from which to develop or hone analysis. And, you know, in the conclusion, we talk about a couple of different sort of ways to think about what it means to end mass incarceration. What does that mean for each individual person? It can be different things for different people. And one of the frameworks that we include is the reformist or non-reformist reform framework, which is a lot of words to say for folks who haven't heard that before, but it's like a years-long abolitionist framework for thinking about whether different kinds of reforms are ones that allow for kind of potentially future and longer big change, and sort of pave the way or leave space for other kinds of reform, or whether they're ones that get in the way of those.
And that kind of just like reinforce the system as it exists.
Yeah. Right. And so, you know, I think it's important for people to think for themselves about which ones make sense to them, which kinds of reforms make sense to them, and what ultimate goal makes sense to them. And that's not something we want to be prescriptive about. So we included all of that information so that folks could develop their own analysis. And I find that very helpful. I find it exciting to hopefully, you know, support people in that process.
And I think I'll just add one other thing about the book. We also write sort of our own introductions to each of the sections. And I think that sort of helps highlight the framing we're considering, or we considered, and putting together the pieces we did, and having the pieces sort of talk to one another, or the contributors talk to one another, oftentimes disagree with one another, for the very reasons Premal says. And, you know, I think it's sort of the value in it is allowing folks, is providing us, and people think through what the issues and questions they have might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, another like question I had for you all was when did you start looking through material? And by that, I mean, you have some stuff that goes back decades, like you have Gideon in here and, you know, some other like elements of the book that, I don't know, if Gideon, the oldest piece you have, you think? Oldest?
I'm not sure, actually. That's a great question.
I was just wondering, like, what I find really interesting is this idea that like this is a relatively new term, but in some ways we've been it's not new, right? Like we've been talking about mass incarceration for a few decades, but only a few decades. And it's sort of like interesting that to think about like temporally, when did you guys start, like how wide is the year span here and why? Like when did you guys sort of decide to start? What was it like period of time that you guys were like, this is a period of time we want to look at, you know, to consider for putting in the book? Or was that not really how, you know?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because some of the pieces are really contemporary, right? Like very, very of the moment in terms of like progressive prosecution and sort of challenges faced by progressive prosecutors. That's like very recent past. And then some of them are court opinions that, like you said, Gideon, that date back, but also other pieces. Some of them are sort of like, you know, decades old kind of abolitionist texts.
Right.
And I don't think we actually had sort of like it has to be of a certain era or time frame. It was more sort of what will resonate in this moment and what will be useful to folks and think about these issues. And then we also filtered for what has something in it that sort of proposes forward-looking action or thinking. So there's obviously tons that's been written about all of this. And one of our filters internally that allowed us to cut things was, does it have a forward-looking element? Is there something here that's like a helpful agent or, you know, sort of component that will move the ball forward in some way?
Yeah. And I wonder about that. Like, so one thing I think is really interesting about this book is how practitioners use it. Like, it's one thing to think about academics and journalists and people who like kind of exist in sort of theoretical spaces, or like not, journalism isn't totally theoretical, but you're not in court having to make decisions, having to like, you know, figure out how to best represent your client and practice your values and try this new thing. You know, it's all these sort of different considerations. And so how do you all imagine practitioners using this text? Like, what do you think is, you know, I was thinking about wanting to give it to a lot of my public defender friends for birthdays, holidays, and, you know, thinking about like how do you imagine them engaging with it in terms of how they, you know, what it means every day when they go to work?
That's a great question. And we love that you're sort of imagining giving it to public defender friends. I'll just give you sort of one concrete example. In the book, we have a chapter on judges, as you mentioned. And then on what happens after prison, after probation, et cetera. What are the and one of the pieces we lift up is a piece by a judge where he sort of asks for information about what are the consequences, what is what is facing someone after prison. And it's incredible. He gets back, you know, all the 35,000 regulations and restrictions and sort of civil death, in the words of Professor Alexander, right? And not only does he get educated about it, but then he does something about it. He doesn't send Miss Desbeth, the woman who is facing prison time to prison. And so
Right.
one of the things we're hoping for here is that here's a judge who's going to work and saying, wait a minute, let me learn more about this. And that's sort of the anti-mass incarceration framework that we're hoping in uplifting some of these pieces, whether you're the sort of the insider or an outsider, a voter who's thinking to themselves, what is happening in my local elections? Who is running for office, right? What is this progressive prosecutor movement? And if it matters to me, I should find out who it is that's running, or I should go out and run myself if you're a potential prosecutor. And so I think that's sort of for us, that's one of the hopes.
Yeah.
By sort of highlighting and lifting up and showing the tensions in the debates, people feel empowered.
Yeah, I mean, what I also hear you saying, I feel, is like allowing people to kind of step back. You're so mired in the weeds so often, I think, and sometimes when you're doing kind of day-to-day practice, and the book is a really good like ability to sort of say, this could look different, this could be different, we could do this differently, in a way that I think is really, really powerful. So there's like a lot of talk about abolition in this book. There's, throughout the sections, and then especially I think at the end, there's a lot of kind of engaging with this idea. You start with Derica, like, we just really kind of, that is a real theme in this book, in a way that, like, had you written it 5 years ago, 6 years ago, probably maybe would not have been as much. There's just been such a shift in the like Overton window of what's possible. I would say, especially since 2020. So do you all think of this as an abolitionist book, or how do you think of this in that way? Like, is that how you would describe it? Or would you sort of see this as like one part of a bigger, conversation?
I think that's a great question. I don't think it's a fill in the blank, anything book in terms of like strategic approach or political analysis. I think, though, that if one self-identifies as an abolitionist, or, is sort of committed to abolition as the political analysis, that that the book contains both like very, very clear abolitionist pieces, like Angela White Davis. I mean, you just can't get more clear. And also many instances of reforms that are precisely the kinds of reforms that folks that are abolitionists are working for every day. Right. So I think that it's helpful and concrete in many ways along those lines. And then going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that the value of leaving space for folks who are coming from different experiences and different backgrounds to author their own political analysis is really important. For us, it was important in this book, partly because we don't all share the same one, and that's sort of reflective in our minds of people in general, but also because, being prescriptive was not a goal here.
Right.
So I think it is like a book that like very carefully and thoughtfully leaves space for folks who are abolitionists to find a lot of value in it. And for folks who are not, to learn about abolition and to come into that space of thinking or not. But it opens doors, hopefully, as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it is not prescriptive. I mean, that's sort of the framework of it. But it allows for the tensions and the discussions and again, the sort of how do we do this and the disagreements, so that, what might work for members of one community doesn't necessarily apply for members of another. I mean, I think that's sort of the point here, right? Is that if you're from a community that isn't a large city, there is much in this book, for instance, that hopefully will be useful. And same, depending west or southwest or northeast. I think that's that's the hope here, because again, the system is not, there's no one system with one actor with one solution.
Right.
So we're starting from the idea of like, here's all this information, and as Premal said, there's certainly enough in there for folks who want to think about or want to learn more about
Right.
abolition, and then we introduce some of the tensions there.
Absolutely. So I have a few more questions, but I'm going to start asking questions from the chat. If you are in the chat, please send questions. We would love to hear from you. And we can go through, there are just a couple in the chat right now. But one question is just this idea that crime has social roots. And so can we really address mass incarceration just through the system? Like what are the parts that are kind of, what are the elements of this problem that can't be answered by looking at players in the system? And like, how do you guys think about that when you were thinking about how to shape this book?
You want me to take it? So yes, I mean, this is a really complex problem, right? This is not going to be sort of tackling the different parts of the system is not going to be enough in the end to tackle the entire thing. And we say that explicitly in the introduction to the book, and that, this is a book about this particular piece of it, and there are definitely other pieces that need to be tackled. And we agree that there are other things that need to be addressed. And so, for example, the million social needs of the people in this country that are not met by our government or social service infrastructure. And that's real. When I personally think about the carceral state or mass incarceration, I tend to think more about the sort of the fact of like the act of the state, right? And so there's like the needs of people that are not met, and that is 100% a significant problem that needs addressing. There's also like why we use the criminal law to address, problems and needs. And that is a related but separate question. And for me is a question, that this book is sort of more connected to in some ways, but still doesn't fully address. There's like a million social and political forces underlying why we use the criminal law for social control and, a variety of other functions. And we need to tackle all of those. While we do that, while we build the infrastructure we want and work towards that,
Right.
while we work to erode, racism and white supremacy and racial capitalism and the forces that undergird the entire system that we have, we also need to figure out what to do about the machinery of the system, because it's there. And so for me personally, these are kind of like related pieces of a problem, and we need to tackle all of them. This book takes on the machinery of the system component of that, very explicitly. But it's 100% true that there are other pieces too.
And I'll just add, and we, as Premal said, we do address it in the introduction, and we include a piece. I mean, in our police chapter, for instance, we start from this wonderful piece by Derek Purnell that sort of brings to the forefront abolition, and we end after thinking about the different ways folks have tried to sort of either change policing or write it or change it so that it dismantles. We end with a piece by Maria Hawilo that precisely addresses this, and that is, look, there are these root causes that need to be addressed politically, that require sort of governments to address, and those root causes stand in the way of dismantling. And so we sort of highlight this debate and ask the reader to consider it, because I think we all, I mean, as I said, we've been public defenders as well, and so you can't escape that. But we also need to think, when we think about dismantling, it does require sort of dealing with the machinery.
Absolutely. So I'm calling for more questions again. If you have them, send them. But I wanted to ask you guys about points at which you might have disagreed. Like, how did you guys manage that? I mean, I assume that like when you have 3 editors, you have literally infinite possible things to include. That it, you know, I don't mean like how did you manage it interpersonally? I just mean like how did you you know, decide what went in and what, I guess, I mean, really what stayed out? Like there's obviously a lot of good stuff out there that's not, you know, gonna be able to make the book, right? And so I'm just very fascinated at the process of like trying to narrow down so much great stuff, and you guys did it wonderfully. But I wonder, like, at what points, you know, how did that manifest in terms of you know, people not always agreeing on certain, you know, pieces or like ideas, maybe even.
I'll jump in and say, Josie, I'm going to go back to when you were mentioning wanting to give the book to public defender friends in particular.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to that because there's, you know, most books about the carceral system, mass incarceration do not talk about public defenders.
Right.
It's like not part of the conversation usually, right? And I think that's for a lot of reasons. Some people think they don't have a lot of power. Some people think they're the good guys, like, you know, the good folks fighting the good fight. And so like, it's not really part of the system. And we included a whole chapter here, not just because we were public defenders, but because we wanted to sort of like bring out some of the tensions and some of the stuff that like doesn't get talked about enough, frankly, about that role in the system. And so that's an area where there was a lot of internal conversation about like how to structure this chapter. It's personal for all 3 of us, in addition to being intellectually interesting. And so, you know, the traditional sort of public defender narratives are often very like heroic, and public defenders are working so hard against all odds. And, you know, all of that is like in many places true and at many times true. And also that's not the full story at all. And it's not always the story at all. And so we included some pieces that really challenge that narrative and that bring to the forefront the very, you know, persuasive arguments about the role that public defenders play in legitimizing the system, and whether, you know, public defenders are sort of serve as offer veneers of legitimacy to a system that is fundamentally illegitimate, right? Like, okay, if this is all horrible, we can all agree the mass incarceration is terrible, the carceral system is churning away, harming people left and right, but don't worry, everyone has a lawyer. So, you know, we've provided this thing, so it's good. And so we included, you know, a Matthew Caldwell essay. We included Paul Butler talking about the promise of Gideon and what it wasn't in real life. And that took a lot of work internally for us, I think, to figure out how to do in a way that was both respectful to the profession and to the role for reasons that we know intimately and care about, because people don't become public defenders for fun, right? Like, you do it because you care about challenging the system. And it's a complex role. So that was one area where we both, you know, the 3 of us really debated a lot and contemplated a lot what felt appropriate to include. And I think in the end, really just sort of put forward this like chapter full of tension. And with the idea that like for readers, it would be, you know, informative and helpful and provoke thought and be challenging in constructive ways. And that we hope will help people think about their own analyses of their own roles and of those around them and the system in general.
And I think, you know, Premal gives this really concrete example, and and she's absolutely right. Right here is a place where we debated. I mean, we really debated throughout. And the one thing I will say, as we sort of the process of it, or as we selected pieces, we may among ourselves not necessarily agree, or rather, the pieces we selected are ones where, or the sort of changes we selected are ones where we have questions about them. I don't necessarily know where I stand, but it's, you know, I have questions. It sort of, I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to struggle with it. And so these were the kinds of pieces and debates we were having, and the ones that we included, whether it was in the public defender chapter or, you know, in the chapter on prisons or policing. Well, there is so much that's been written about police. So how do we make those decisions? And there's a lot that's said about judges and sentencing, but what about governors and clemency? Should we include that? So there's a real sort of debate and discussion and decisions, because those were, that was what was happening as we were writing and reading these pieces.
Right. So we have a question about like where you all learn things from. So we have a question from Abigail, who says that she is joining from the state of Victoria in Australia, where advocates have recently achieved a big step in a positive direction, closing 2 of the state's prisons, including our largest prison, which is also one of 3 private prisons in the state. So I know it really is incredible. And the question is, I'm wondering if the panel could reflect on whether there's a need for international collaboration between advocates and organizers to learn from successes in other systems and jurisdictions. And is there anything you've learned from overseas that has been influential on your research and advocacy?
It's a great, well, first of all, that's amazing. Oh, sorry, Maria, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say that's incredible. Congratulations on closing.
It is incredible. I, you know, feel under-equipped to answer the question. So the answer is yes, we should be learning more. Have I learned enough? No. So I think I have a lot to learn about things that are happening in other countries. And I do think that there's a lot that people in the United States could learn from other countries about a lot of things, including this. And for many reasons, we don't learn enough. And so, so I would love to learn more. And I also, though, will say that, you know, the United States has particular historical legacies, and particular social ills and particular, you know, frameworks of oppression. It's important for us here doing work here to remember that and to not think that we can necessarily apply every single lesson learned from other places here. That said, I think we have a lot to learn.
Yeah, I think first of all, it's a fantastic question. I just came back from Italy, where I taught a course on comparative carceral states, and the goal of the course was to learn and be in conversation about not just international perspectives, but comparative perspectives as it relates to mass incarceration. And one of sort of the things that I came away with is that we were better at the comparative approach in this particular area in the 1960s, in the 1950s. The law journals in the United States were publishing international comparative law texts related to mass incarceration and mass criminalization. And then there was a total drop-off. It wasn't published at all. And in part, that's because, and it wasn't discussed, and arguments weren't being made at the federal courts about how our other places did this. It is also the case that in some of the, and you know, with the caveat that Premal says, which is our legacy of slavery is one that is embedded and intertwined, and the continued racism in the system is embedded and intertwined in our criminal justice system. But as you know, if you sort of pan out and you see how Norway, and we include a piece on the international perspective in this reader, and other countries sort of shifted. There was some mass criminalization there, and they began to shift, and they, you know, changed their prison model, and it was more social, and it was smaller, and sentences weren't as lengthy. I think we have a lot to learn, and I think there's a conversation that we here have an obligation to have amongst ourselves about this international perspective.
Yeah. Okay, I think that we're almost done. If anybody has any other questions, they can send them, but I just have one more question for you all. This has been really great and interesting. And next time, if you need a fourth editor, I'm a girl. This is like, sounds like a really great and exciting kind of, yeah, just, I mean, that's related to my next question, which is sort of like, what were you guys kind of surprised to learn during this process that you didn't, you know, you kind of put a book together to tell other people things. And then I'm assuming that when you do something like this, you're also learning a lot in ways that maybe you didn't predict or expect. And so I'm wondering kind of what was the most surprising part of this process, and like what did it yeah, what did it bring to light for you that maybe you would not have expected?
Sorry, my child's
I
screaming
think
background,
the
so
public,
bear
I
with
mean,
me.
I think for me, the public defender selections that Premal was talking about, this real sort of disagreement, you know, where there's this real disagreement about whether public defenders are helping entrench the system, and if they are, how could they do something about it? That's something that was really important to learn about. There's also there was, in the judges' discussion, for me at least, you know, we've heard a little bit more about progressive prosecutors and the push to elect progressive prosecutors and what does it mean, and can that dismantle, and that's all included on the prosecutors chapter. We've heard a lot less about judges. They stay in the background of all of our conversations when we talk about the system, in some ways in the same way as public defenders do. We hear about them when it comes to sentencing, but we rarely hear about them as actors with will when it comes to dismantling. And so I think learning about sort of the election of progressive judges and the efforts that are out there to sort of make a push for this was something that for me was something that I learned, and something, you know, that our debates brought out. So that's sort of my answer to that.
Yeah, I love that answer.
And I'll just say, as someone who's a lawyer who, you know, I think has thought about this stuff a bunch and also has never enough. The aftermath chapter was one where we were basically like reading a million different essays and articles and pieces about the consequences that follow folks after the prison gates open. And I know many of them, you know, I've you know, studied and thought about many of them, and there are always ones that I have never thought about or learned about. There's always more. There's always more than I ever think they're going to be. And so for me, that's always a healthy reminder of what I don't know, and just shocking, and a reminder of why this is important.
Yeah, this it is important. It's so important. I really recommend everybody get this book. What I really love about it is that, I mean, you can read it front to back if you want, but you could also like read it and come back to it so many times. It's really useful. You can start on one section and go to it. Like, it really is a book that you can kind of engage with on your own terms. And so I'm very grateful for you guys for putting this together. I am so grateful for you guys having me to talk tonight. And thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Josie.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for being part of this discussion. We're really appreciative.
And
I was making a ton of notes as we were talking. I was like doing both. So it's been very helpful.
And City Lights would like to thank the three of you for gracing our halls tonight and for this very vital discussion. Premal Dharia, Maria Hawilo, congratulations on this important new book. City Lights would also like to thank you for the important work that you've been doing. And Josie Duffy Rice, thank you for doing the honors. You are such a great interviewer. Very grateful to the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you.